Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for dialing in our webinar today. My name is Paola Condemaita and I'm a project manager at journalismfund.eu. I'm in charge of our Modern Slavery Unveiled grant program. At journalismfund.eu, we are dedicated to advancing independent and investigative journalism across Europe that serves the public interest, furthers accountability as well as transparency, and contributes to critical thinking and well-informed debate. Today, we will be discussing how to report about human trafficking responsibly and featuring Aidan White, Charles Autheman, and Wahyu Dhyatmika. You can expect each speaker to have the floor for about 15 minutes, and we will conduct a short questions and answers at the end of the 3 presentations. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window. We will address them during the questions and answers at the end of the program. And by the end of our time today, we hope you feel that you have more tools to report about human trafficking. This webinar is part of the training program of our Modern Slavery Unveiled grant program. And apart from this training, we also offer grants to journalists who team in cross-border of professional journalists teams who can apply for a grant to cover working time and expenses to investigate, document, and expose aspects and cases of forced labor. The main focus of this program is on the exploitation of Asian victims in Europe, so you can apply. Our next call is in March, and we will give you more information as well about this at the end of our webinar. We will also like to inform you that we will issue a certificate for those interested in getting one. And at the end of the program, we will share with you a QR code that will direct you to the survey, and we will send you the link via the chat as well. Having said this, we will also like to know from where you are following this webinar. So right now, we will share a question on your screen, and you can tell us from which continent you are connecting to. So let me share this questionnaire now with you. And now you can see it. So it will be really nice for us to know from where you are following this webinar, because we really hope that it will be useful for everyone who is reporting about human trafficking and modern slavery. So far, we have people from Asia, Africa, Europe, North America. So thank you to all who registered, to all those who registered for this webinar. We really hope that you could learn and grab some new tools to report ethically about these issues. So thank you so much. We are still receiving some answers. We have a lot of people from Europe. Thank you to all those journalists who are connecting. And now, people from North America. Great, that's really nice to see. Thank you, thanks a lot. And we will also organize some other webinars in the future. So if you would like to participate, don't hesitate to contact us. We also share our events on our social media, so you can also follow us there. So I just ended our poll and we will see. Do you see it? Yes. So thank you to all those journalists from Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. We will record this session anyways for those who were not able to connect at this moment, but afterwards they will be able to see and to watch the webinar to use all the tools that we will be learning today. So, okay. Now we will continue, and it's time to have our first presentation. We will start with Wahyu Dhyatmika, who will be speaking on how to find and recruit victims and survivors. Wahyu is an investigative reporter and editor for Tempo Media Group, an independent news organization based in Jakarta. He's a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Wahyu is also a board member of the Alliance of Independent Journalists and Secretary General of the Indonesian Cyber Media Association. So thank you, Wahyu. We move on to now to listen to you. Let me put you now on the screen. So now everyone is seeing you. So now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Based on wherever you're based, I see that you come from all over the place, all over the world. So thank you so much for attending this workshop. I'm going to be very briefly share my experience doing a story on human trafficking. And hopefully from that story, you guys can get some insights, get some ideas on how to find and recruit victims or survivors of modern slavery. Let me just share my screen so you can follow my presentation better. I hope you already see it now. So I think Charles will give a better explanation on the nature of modern slavery and human trafficking, but it's suffice to say that it's a big problem with very limited media coverage in our media landscape nowadays. One of the reports that I always refer to is the one that was published back in 2018 by the International Labour Organization and Walk Free Foundation with partnership with IOM. It's a big survey involving more than 70,000 respondents, and it gave us a very vivid picture of what the condition of modern slavery in the world. It gave us an estimate number of forced labor in the world. It's around 40.3 million, and 70% of the total victims are living in Asia and Middle East. The three countries that were mentioned as the highest number of estimated slavery are China, Pakistan, and India. So you can check the reports in this website. I hope you can see it. It's globalslaveryindex.org. It gives a prevalence map of where the places the modern slavery is estimated still happening. I think it's a good way to start the research, your research on this topic. Because understanding the places where it happens and also the areas of what constitute as modern slavery. So it's also consists of forced labor, exploitation, forced marriage, forced sexual exploitation, and even state-imposed forced labor. And for some of you who are wondering the connection between human trafficking and modern slavery, well, human trafficking is the logistical supply chain for modern slavery. So people who get forced into the landscape of the modern slavery landscape usually were trafficked to this very poor condition. And once they become victims, it's really difficult for them to get away from this condition because they have no legal protection. They were taken away from their community, taken away from their social support, traffic to faraway places that they don't know, and that make them very vulnerable and make them lose all of their ability to protect themselves, and that makes it very difficult to expose this kind of crime because victims themselves sometimes, more often than not, has no ability to voice their their grievances, their problems. And just to give it a bit of a context, these are the top 5 industries where there is a big risk. Products produced in these industries involve some sort of forced labor or modern slavery. You can see there is all kind of products that usually get exported to the first world countries, from computers to sugar, from fish to garments. So it's a very close problem. It's sometimes it's around us, but we just as a journalist need to be more vigilant and be more aware to see and to find the victims and the survivors. And that's what I was asked to share. How do we then start the investigation into this topic? So there are several ways, of course, to identify and to locate the first source, so to say, in this kind of stories. My always I first go to source usually is the civil society organizations that usually advocate for the victims of human trafficking. You can find them in many countries. They are usually very vocal in advocating for better protection for migrant workers or for victims of human trafficking. And in some civil society organizations, they also provide shelters for survivors or for people who manage to get away or to run away from the modern slavery system. If you are lucky enough to get the trust from the victims, from the survivors, they can be your first source to start exposing the bigger story behind this individual plight. They can also become a very good source to understand the whole network of the human trafficking and the context, the scale of the crime, the networks, the people, the enabler who are people who make this crime possible. The second, usually very good source to start with is the law enforcement agencies. Because of course this is a form of criminal acts, trafficking, human trafficking, and there's a lot of investigation by the police involving these cases. Sometimes they can also help you get an understanding of the bigger picture in terms of law enforcement. And they can also help you connect with families that probably reports these cases in the first place, and you can also start from there to identify the victims. Social media is another source if you want to start like finding voices from victims. In Indonesia, for example, there's so big users of Twitter and Facebook, and these victims of human trafficking usually communicate with each other. They use codes, of course, and sometimes it's not very easy to get access to their networks. But once you have an opening and you can gain trust from the networks, you can be able to find some stories from the social media networks that you able to enter. I will give an example of a story that Tempo and Malaysia Kini did collaboratively back 5 or 6 years ago, to give you an example of how these methods are used when we actually doing the reporting on the ground. But one of the few things to consider once you identify or locate the survivor is try to talk to them directly, not via intermediary. Of course, you need to build trust and good relationship with them. Aidan will give more on this ethical principles on interviewing or reporting on human trafficking. Sometimes you need someone from the civil society organization itself to guarantee you, to vet you, to give you direct access to the people who has the story. Get the story details, of course, and verify it with independent sources is another next part of the reporting. And once you get access to the first victims, usually then you will be able to use snowball technique to get to the next one, or to be able to expand the search into the next survivor once you get to the first one. And always be alerted if your interviewee look depressed or stressed out during the interview, especially if the setting of the interview is not ideal for the safety of your source. Okay, so I think still have a few more minutes to share my one of my reporting on human trafficking. It's about a human trafficking network that happened in Malaysia. The victims are Indonesian young women, usually from East Nusa Tenggara, in the eastern part of Indonesia. Besides, then the bigger picture is there's until now more than 1.5 million undocumented Indonesian workers in Malaysia. They work in various sectors illegally. To shed lights on this story, Info in Malaysia Kini. Malaysia Kini is an independent publication based in Kuala Lumpur. We collaborate together to investigate one aspect of the human trafficking back in 2016. So the story began with this raid at this small office in North Sumatra. The police raided this office because they received a complaint from a woman who escaped from the office, that who complained that she got abused during her working arrangement in this office. And when the police raided the office, they found dozens of women ready to be sent abroad to Malaysia as migrant workers. And they have no full documentation to work as migrant workers, and sometimes they are not even above the age to work as migrant workers in another country. So this is the office that got raided by the police, and we also found out that the place where most of the women come from is from another place, 3 or 4 hours by flight from North Sumatra. It's a place called Kupang in eastern Nusa Tenggara. And the police there reported they have more than 2,000 migrant workers from the area sent abroad every year, and suspected as victims of human trafficking syndicates. Along that line, just a year before, the media reports a woman also from Kupang named Sarlin Agustina Jinip, who arrived from Malaysia and then exposed by the local authorities for not having the right documentation. And then found out that she was also victims of human trafficking from Indonesia. So all of these different puzzles then came together once our colleague from Malaysia Kini were able to identify this local agency in Kuala Lumpur that has been sending money to different parts of Indonesia, asking recruiters in villages to find young women to work as maid or factory workers in Malaysia. There will be promises for them to work in spa or beauty salons, beauty parlors, but they end up doing a more domestic works and without having the conditions that they were promised when they were recruited. We got also help from the from the law enforcement agency to be able to get the exact transfer, the money transfer, and who received the money transfer from this Kuala Lumpur agency. And this is one of the houses of the local agency that received that regular money from Malaysia. And apparently, the woman who received the money are the one who mentioned in the beginning of this story, the one that got raped by the police in North Sumatra. So it became full circle. The network that was responsible for the recruitment of this poor young woman, usually they're not even finished high school. They're not even 17, maybe below 17 years old, and they got promised to work in abroad and get a salary, and they end up doing slave jobs. So this is one of the result of the investigation. We create a map to show the journey of the traffickers. Starting from the small village in East Nusa Tenggara where it happens, and use different phases of the survivors to give a real narrative of how this network of criminal traffickers operate. And this is one of the factories that employ these victims of human traffickers in Klang. Kuala Lumpur. This is some of the condition of the Indonesian laborers that work in Malaysia with their documents usually withheld by their employer. So after the reports, the police raid some of the factories that employ these victims of human trafficking. And they got freed. Some of them returned to Indonesia safely and reunited with their families. And I think that's one of the biggest joy that we have from reporting the stories. We are able to give good news back to the family, miss them for the first place. So I think the lesson learned from this story is quite simple. That it's human trafficking is it's a group crime. It's conducted by a network of people. Sometimes they don't know each other in person. Sometimes they work in cells. But if we can get the connection between the different parts of the networks, then we'll be able to show how this trafficking happened and help notify the public to prevent it from happening again. From the victims that we've been talking to, it's like I said in the beginning, they have no protection once they leave their social system. Their whole life sometimes depends on their traffickers. They willingly follow them because they promise this job, and once they don't get what they promise, all their documents are usually withheld, and they have no ways to break off from that condition. So it's a very bad condition, and they really powerless in that regards. But because of their sensitivity and the condition that they are under, it's very important for journalists to really be considerate in trying to contact them. We have to look at the setting of the interview, and sometimes they don't even want to talk because it's going to give them more problems if they speak without the permission of the traffickers. We always start with the survivors or someone who already get out from the trafficking situation and then manage to escape. And then work our story from there, because it's safer for the survivors to share it instead of someone who's still inside the system. As I said, Aidan will speak after me, and he will give more on the ethical principle of interviewing victims of modern slavery. So I think that's all I can share for me. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward for the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Wahyu. Thank you for this presentation. I'm sure journalists will then ask you some questions at the end of the 3 presentations. Thank you so much. So now we will move on to our next speaker, who is Aidan White. Let me put Aidan now with us now. There he is. Well, he's Aidan White, a journalist. He's director of the Ethical Journalist Network, a global campaign promoting good governance and ethical conduct in media. He was the general secretary of the International Federation of Journalists from 1987 until April 2011. He previously worked for several newspapers in the United Kingdom. He was with The Guardian in London prior to joining the Investigation Federation of Journalists. The fight for ethical and free journalists has always been at the center of White's work. So, Aidan, thank you so much for being here. So now the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed. And I mean, I have to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words this afternoon or morning, wherever you may be. First of all, I mean, I think I'm not going to be making a presentation because I don't particularly want to impinge upon the sort of good detailed information that's going to come from my colleagues. And you've already heard how the numbers are staggering about modern slavery and trafficking. And they're an indicator that slavery isn't just a shameful part of human history. It's actually in plain sight in the modern world. And it's a complex and sophisticated story that is riddled with ethical challenges. And I think it's one that we really need as journalists to take very seriously about how we deal with the questions. The first thing I really sort of want to say is that in covering this particular story, or the story of migration or human trafficking and so on, it's really important to understand the difficult context in which journalists find themselves. Journalists reporting on stories like this, you have to recognize that we are moving into the area of investigating wrongdoing and malpractice, corruption at a very high level, very often corruption and bribery involving state officials or people who work for the government. Certainly, we are making ourselves known by asking difficult questions to people working in criminal underworld. And so therefore, the issues related to how we deal with the story are both personal and professional. The personal ones are to make sure that when we're dealing with this story, we don't put ourselves at undue risk, that we ensure that the people we are talking to are not put at risk. So I think it's very important when we begin to sort of think about how we cover the story, that we take account of the potential risks that are involved in covering it. The first thing I should say is that covering trafficking and migration really is one issue where we have to sort of be ethically very strong. I think and in terms of ethics, it's not a matter just of parroting or mimicking the codes of our national union or National Journalists Association and so on. It's important to bear in mind that what makes journalism different and what makes us able to report this issue with some authority and public purpose are the basic ethics of our profession. And I think it's really important, just very quickly, to recap on the important role that they play. There are 5 core values that exist within journalism, and they all come into play when reporting on human trafficking. The first core value is accuracy and fact-based reporting. Of course, all journalists need to avoid malicious lies, and they don't deal in fake news, and they don't deal in rumor and speculation. But what we have to do is to make sure that we are in the business of verifying information as much as we can. And sometimes it's very difficult to come by information that's really reliable. Actually, even the international organizations that are dealing with trafficking and migrations don't have access to the exact figures of what the numbers are. A lot of the figures you've already seen, and a lot of the figures you see are educated research and guesswork. But we have to, as best we can, be accurate and fact-based in our reporting, particularly on this issue. Secondly, we have to make sure that we are independent. You know, that our editorial independence is really very, very jealous for journalists, and we have to make sure that we're not being dictated to by individuals or political groups or politicians or institutions in order to shape stories to satisfy other interests. So that key editorial independence is essential. Thirdly, when we're reporting on this issue, the notion of impartiality is very difficult to take by, because of course, you know, journalists aren't impartial on the inhumanity of human trafficking. We're not at all. And it's our job to expose it and to contribute to the process of hopefully to eradicate it. But we have to be impartial in the way that we gather the information and we gather the stories. We have to make sure that we are inclusive, that we are including all voices in the way that we tell the story. We have to make sure that the victims and the survivors of these processes are properly consulted. We have to make sure that the communities where these people come from and the communities where they end up are also sort of represented, that we don't rely on so-called expert voices alone and international commentators or politicians, but we actually have to be as inclusive as possible. So impartiality in the process of gathering the information is really important. Fourthly, and probably the most important ethic to apply to telling this story, is the ethic of humanity. It's not our business to promote hate speech, and it's not our business to incite people to conflict or to violence. And we have to show humanity in the way that we gather our information, the way we assemble it, and the way that we tell the story. Humanity is an essential part of journalism. We don't engage in hate speech. We don't engage in incitement to violence. So what we have to do in every aspect of our work is to show humanity, and that ethical principle is essential. Fifthly, is the whole question of accountability. Journalists really sometimes find it very difficult to face up to their own mistakes, but we make a lot of mistakes, and we make mistakes all the time. And actually, owning up to our mistakes, showing that we're accountable and responsible, is actually an aspect of professionalism which is extremely important to everyone and to all of us. So these 5 core values of journalism are our starting point for how we cover this story: fact-based and accurate communications, editorial independence in the way we work, impartiality in the process of gathering the information, humanity above all in the way that we tell the story, and responsibility and accountability for dealing with our mistakes. So how do we go about it? Well, we have to talk to people, and we have to understand what we're doing. The absolute starting point for covering this story is to know what you're talking about. Every journalist should make themselves aware about national and international laws and policies regarding migration, human trafficking, human smuggling, and so on. We need to know exactly what rules are being broken and how people are being exploited. So a sound knowledge of international policy and law is extremely important. We also have to understand the basics of the story itself. We have to make sure that we know the difference between human trafficking and migrant smuggling. They're really quite distinct and quite different. Human trafficking, as we know, is a crime against the person. It's non-consensual. The person who's involved doesn't give validated consent. And it's part of a longer term exploitative relationship. And it involves heavy profits from that exploitation. And inevitably, it involves networks, people who supply people to others who carry on the process of exploitation. And therefore, human trafficking is really quite distinct and appalling crime against the person, which we have to see. Now, migrant smuggling, for example, is quite different. It's a very straightforward process. Migrant smuggling it basically involves helping people to cross borders, very often irregularly so. That is to say, it's a way of helping people to get around migration rules or entry rules to move from one country or one region to another. And it involves the consent of the person involved, and it's usually a one-off and commercial relationship. Now, both of these issues, migrant smuggling and human trafficking, can involve human rights abuse. So we always have to be aware of where that abuse is. But they are quite distinctive. They are quite distinctive processes, and journalists really need to understand very well what those differences are. Now, there's a whole number of different terms that journalists have to be aware of. They have to be aware of the national referral mechanism, which is a national office linked to international framework for identifying the victims of human trafficking or modern slavery. That exists in Europe, for example, and it's an extremely important part of the process of monitoring exactly how human trafficking is going on. We have to be careful about how we use terms like undocumented or irregular migrant. We have to understand that the term modern slavery and slavery, exactly what it means and exactly how it's referred to in international law. All sorts of elements of work are involved in human trafficking. And this is why the International Labour Organization, the ILO, plays such an important role in identifying problems and so on. So questions related to forced labor, domestic servitude, child labor, sex trafficking, all of these are extremely important parts of the puzzle that actually journalists have to be able to put together. Bonded labor, contract slavery, the worst forms of child labor, all of these are terms and conditions which journalists should make themselves aware of if they're going to be able to deal with the story effectively. One of the most important aspects of the story is inevitably how we deal with survivors and the victims of modern slavery and trafficking. And the fact of the matter is, this is a serious moment for journalists, because what they have to do is they have to interview clients. Now, interview people, and interviewing is we all know, we think we can do interviews, but actually we need to be very, very careful about our sources of information, how we use them. The first thing to remember ethically when you're talking with someone who's been a victim of trafficking, or someone who is a survivor, is that they have been through an ordeal. And that what we shouldn't do in our process through interviewing is actually to make that worse. We have to be sensitive to the sufferings and ordeals that people have had to deal with. So in our interviewing and our dealing with sources, we should immediately sort of establish good relations with the people that we're talking to. We should explain to them always what is our intention. We should not use subterfuge. We should explain who we are and what we want to do. And we should make them feel comfortable. we should actually assist them to be able to talk freely, but not in any way that will sort of hurt or injure their process. Particularly, we have to respect their privacy. Everyone has the right to privacy. We also have to take special care when we're dealing with children and minors. So remember, if we're illustrating stories, we have to be very careful to get people permission and so on. Finally, I just want to say that modern slavery and sex and trafficking doesn't take place just in far off countries. It's very often in plain sight in Western Europe and other developed countries. Wherever people are working in areas of cheap labor, there is the possibility of someone who's being forced to do that work, someone who is at risk. So whether it's car washes or nail bars, or it's people who are available for domestic duties and so on, if a job is being done and it's extremely cheap, then there's a question that an inquiring journalist should be asking. So looking for and finding this story is absolutely essential. Finally, the one thing I want to say is there are a couple of problems that journalists always face, which we have to be very careful about on this story. The first is the rush to publish. Journalists are always under pressure to get their stories out as quickly as possible and to get it published as quickly as possible. We should try and avoid a rush to publish. We should try to make sure that we take our time to be ethical. And secondly, we have to avoid the influence of social media. Social media can be very helpful in terms of providing us with initial information and so on, but social media should never lead a story. They should never be the story that we as journalists are following. That's actually what we have to do ourselves. So we have to make sure that our stories, when we produce them, are factual, ethical, and that the people who we have talked to have been treated well, and that they know that they're contributing to what I hope will be a progressive journalism story. That is to say, action through good public purpose journalism, which is helping to eliminate and to eradicate the problem of human trafficking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm sure journalists learned a lot from your experience. And now we will move forward with our next speaker. He is Charles Autheman. Now you will see him with me. Thank you, Charles, for accepting this invitation. Well, he is a French independent consultant. He has been organizing and facilitating training for workshops for journalists, trade unionists, and communication professionals for the past 10 years in over 20 different countries, mostly in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. More recently, he coordinated the production of the first media-friendly glossary on migration and the ILO Media Toolkit on Forced Labor and Fair Recruitment. Thank you so much, Charles, for being here. So now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I'm very pleased to join you for this session. I was listening with a lot of attention to what Wahyu and Aidan were saying, and I'll try to continue in the line of thought that they started to expose. I'll focus mostly my presentation on the relationship between journalists and civil society organizations. What can journalists benefit from working with civil society organizations on these issues? And on the other hand, also, how can civil society organizations bring greater awareness about trafficking issues with the help of journalists? I've prepared a short presentation and I'll try to make sure that you have access to it. After this webinar, I'll be showing some links as well, and I'll make sure that the links are within the presentation as well. First of all, I'd like to try and share with you some ideas about what I think makes a successful investigation on human trafficking. It starts with what Aidan was saying, the homework part, understanding the story. I've done quite a lot of research recently trying to see whether human trafficking is introduced in journalism education. And it's very, very rare to find examples of universities, of journalism schools that actually teach human trafficking. What that means is that maybe this is not the case for some of you in the room, but most journalists who will happen to report on human trafficking don't have a lot of background information about what this is. They are not specialized on reporting on these issues, and they happen to report on human trafficking because there is a case happening in their community or happening in an area that they cover, whether it's an industry, a region, or a specific beat. And so the real first step is to understand the story. Aidan made reference to the legal framework. That's very important, understanding the concepts. You might have seen that both Wahyu and Aidan speak of survivors, maybe rather than victims. And it's true that over time, people who work on human trafficking have come to look at the people who survive this crime as survivors with an agency and not only as passive victims. So that's all the part of understanding the story. Then you want to find the story. It might land directly on your desk, but you might actually want, after this webinar or in the process of this grant program with Journalism Fund, you might want to actually do some research. You've heard of what Aidan was saying, it's hiding in plain sight, and you might want to bring that back to where you work and find stories. That's the second important part, finding a good story and one that you can carry without having to rush and with the proper resources available to you. Once you have that, you're going to go on the ground. This is where most of the ethical challenges that were shared previously, and I've seen some questions in chat relating to that, that's where the encounter with the sources of information happens. And a lot of the concrete challenges are here. The safety, the security challenges, working with images, all of that happens in this part of the work where you're actually collecting the information. Telling the story is also very important. This is where you're going to define exactly how you're going to expose what you've found, where you're going maybe to take extra care to protect some of the sources of information, because we must remember that human trafficking is directly related to organized crime, and therefore it requires a lot of care in terms of how you tell this story. And maybe it's a bit different from other stories that journalists can report on. It doesn't necessarily end with the publication. In many instances, journalists will reveal something and expect some form of action, whether from the judiciary, maybe some policy. And so it's a typical case where this is a story where there's an incentive for journalists to follow up. The challenges that you have and that we need to keep in mind is that it's a very complex issue. I would say specifically in the framework of this project that Journalism Fund is doing, looking at human trafficking specifically across a corridor from Asia to Europe, it's very complex. Few journalists, I imagine, within the room have very good understanding of dynamics both in Europe and in Asia as well. So you're always going to have to rely maybe on some outside expertise. The transnational dimension makes it very difficult to report on. And this maybe explains why there's so much impunity around human trafficking, the transnational dimension. We must always keep in mind that there are vulnerable sources of information involved. Obviously, those who have been trafficked, but other sources of information who might be around them as well, families, relatives, human rights defenders. And so it's a story where vulnerability is all around. As I've said before, it's connected to organized crime, and that requires a lot of caution. I've put COVID-19 in the challenges for two reasons. First of all, because we've yet to have any precise data on the impact of COVID-19 on human trafficking, but people who work on this issue tend to believe that all of the factors that tend to explain human trafficking have been made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. Deceptive recruitment, for example, fraudulent recruitment of workers where they will be offered something and then they will be deceived into something else. This works very effectively on populations that are marginalized, that are vulnerable, and we've seen the impact of COVID-19 in a number of countries on the economy, and so we can expect that most probably more people will be at risk of human trafficking because of COVID-19. It's also a challenge because COVID-19 is most probably making this reporting these issues more complex. I said before, it's a transnational issue. Prior to COVID-19, maybe some of our suggestions would be, well, if you want to understand trafficking issues between Indonesia and Malaysia, like Wahyu was saying, maybe you should go to both countries and travel. We know that currently it's very difficult to move around, and it might be so for another couple of years. Even if it becomes simple to travel again, maybe news organizations will not be so keen to spend all those resources needed to travel. They'll rely more on digital interaction. So COVID-19 is challenging the way we report on these issues, might bring some opportunities, but it's definitely something to bear in mind. And the last challenge I'd like you to have in mind is that this is not a static issue. Especially with regards to the legal framework. It's an issue that is changing actually quite quickly. For those who work in Europe, you might be following discussions about mandatory human rights due diligence, which are underway with the European Parliament. Legal framework, how countries, regional organizations like the European Union respond to challenges like human trafficking or forced labor are changing and are changing quite quickly. And that means that if you are interested in these issues, you will need to keep on learning and adapting to the changing landscape. I'll just share a first link. I've told you that in reporting this issue, you want to go through different process, understanding, finding the story, getting the story. This is actually the backbone of the toolkit that Paola was referring to. I'll share the link. There's a lot of useful information for you in terms of deepening your understanding of how to report on these issues. So that's just to mention that. Going back to the presentation, I now want to focus on what civil society organizations can provide. Well, they can almost help you tick the boxes for every step of the investigation. Obviously, civil society organizations can provide expertise. In many instances, they are the ones, along with maybe national authorities working specifically on these issues, who in a given country will have most expertise on the topic. So if you want to improve your understanding of the issue, my first advice would be to try and identify in your country or on the topic that you're working on the thematic that you're working on, a civil society organization that is relevant. I've put some examples here to show you that civil society organizations working on human trafficking can be operating at the national level. You have Athena here, or Project Liberate. Athena is in Serbia, Project Liberate is in Malaysia. They look at human trafficking maybe in a broad perspective at the country level. You also have organizations who look at human trafficking not necessarily from a country, but from a sectoral perspective. We know and we have a greater understanding that there is a lot of human trafficking happening at sea, for example, in fishing. And human rights at sea might be the go-to organization when you want to improve your understanding of the context and what human trafficking at sea actually means. And within the family of civil society organizations, there's, I think, one very important type of civil society organization, which is survivor-led civil society organizations of human trafficking. I've given the example of the Survivor Alliance, but there are other examples, and these are very, very important organizations. Also because beyond the expertise and context that they can provide, these organizations often have a lot of guidance to give to journalists. I think Aidan has given us a very theoretical framework about the ethics in journalism, but concretely, how does that apply, and how can you best interview a survivor? Well, I think no one is better placed than a civil society organization composed of survivors to tell you how to go about it. Also because in many cases, this is not a topic where you will be given a definitive answer. Oh, this is the what you must absolutely do. It's quite sensitive, and most of the guidance will be about taking time, finding the good approach, the good context. Civil society organizations can also give access to sources of information. The initial idea would be to help you find victims or survivors of human trafficking. That's possible, but by their very good understanding of how human trafficking works and the different actors who are involved, they can be very useful interpreters of the landscape to help you identify relevant sources of information in this sometimes complex area. Many human trafficking organizations, by the nature of this crime, are operating in networks. This can be at the EU level, this can be at the country level, this can be at the transnational, interregional level. And so when you are working in a given country, for example, in Belgium, and you're in touch with an organization in Belgium, that civil society organization can open you the doors to a number of organizations, introduce you to organizations, and help you get in touch with human trafficking civil society organizations in different regions. That can be very useful. And also, in accompanying the work that you do in reporting this issue, civil society organizations tend to lobby, they tend to advocate, they tend to do things that journalists supposedly don't do. And CSOs can absolutely do that, following up, building up on the work of journalists. There are several nicely done directories. I think we have a participant in the room who is from the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women. I saw that in the chat earlier. I've put these two websites as examples of websites where you can go to actually find interesting expertise or civil society organizations. This is the Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Expert. It's very nicely done. You can search by country, by region, and find organizations with the relevant details, what they do, who they are. So these types of websites can be very useful in identifying civil society organizations in different countries. That can help you if you have a story idea, or if you're just interested in exploring human trafficking in a given country, that can be very, very useful. Going back to my presentation, and Paola, please tell me if I've wasted all of my time. 2 minutes. So very quickly, I'd like to go the other way around now. Why are journalists important for CSOs? Well, even though there is increasingly, and Aidan has spoken about social media is most probably a good example of that. CSOs tend to communicate directly with their audience increasingly through their website, through social media. Journalists, in many cases, can offer an audience that is much broader than what a civil society organization can reach through its traditional communication. It can bring visibility to small civil society organizations, and it can help civil society organizations get a reputation that is very, very important. When a lot of the actors, I was referencing Project Liberate, for example, in Malaysia, which was started as a small organization. When you have an important newspaper who talks about your work, it brings you visibility, credibility, which is very, very important for civil society organizations working on these issues. It's also, I think, quite important in the context that we have right now, which is a context of infodemia, of misinformation, of fake news, and therefore we need to work with trusted sources of information. And currently, journalists in many countries are still perceived as trusted sources of information. And so for civil society organizations, having information go through a news outlet is a way, to make sure that this information is going to be considered correctly and appropriately. And there are examples, I've put the link in the presentation of this campaign that was done by a news organization in Malaysia called R.Age, where journalists and a civil society organization partnered together to shed light on a case of student trafficking, where students were being tricked to come into Malaysia to have to work to repay the debt. One last slide, some recommendations. I've used the word journalist a lot, the word civil society organization a lot. I didn't mean in any way to describe these professions as being homogeneous. There's a lot of different forms of journalism. There's a lot of different types of civil society organizations, but I think the recommendations I can give tend to apply to all. First of all, first recommendation would be to keep the appropriate distance. Journalists and civil society organizations can have common battles when it comes to human trafficking, but a journalist is not here to be the PR of a civil society organization, and a civil society organization is not here just to give access to victims or survivors, and that's it. So everyone has to stay in its appropriate role. And also, it's important to consider the short-term and the long-term impact. As Aidan was saying, there's a lot of pressure put on the shoulders of journalists, often to rush to publication, but irrespective of whether they rush to publication or not, in many cases, journalists will move on to another story. Civil society organizations tend to focus on human trafficking and stick to that. So when working together, it might happen that you disagree on how quickly or how you're supposed to expose this story. These misunderstandings might come from the fact that you're not necessarily considering the short-term and the long-term impact. So it's really important to keep that in mind. That's it for the presentation. Apologies if I've been a bit long.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for your presentation. Let me, okay. Thank you for your presentation, Charles, and thank you to all our speakers who have been presenting and sharing their experience with us this afternoon. So now we will proceed to have some questions. So first, I would like to read and to share with you the questions that we received during your presentation. So we will go for the first one, and we have Crystal Snyder, who is asking, well, I don't try to reply to her internally, but I will read the question. So maybe, Aidan, you can also share your answer with everyone. The question was, what are the best practices for journalists safely engaging survivors' voices and communities while reporting that considers not re-exploiting when reporting? So Aidan, could you please develop and answer this question?
Well, it's very straightforward. I think that journalists should do nothing that makes the ordeal worse for survivors and so on. So I think what's very important, there are very, very simple rules to be. The first one is always be very open. Say who you are and what you would want, what you want to do with the information you get. Secondly, make sure that you interview people in a safe space. Make them feel comfortable. make sure that they're in an environment where they feel they can talk freely. Thirdly, don't ask leading questions. Don't try to get them to tell the story that you've got in your head. Get them to tell their own story. Allow them to talk at their own pace. And through that, you will be able to allow them to get to where you would like to go in terms of the information. So, I mean, above all, I think what you have to do is to ensure that you're communicating to people that their engagement with you will make things better. That actually your role is not just to tell their story, but it's to continue to help them, to protect them, to ensure that they are safe and that their security is guaranteed. So it's really important to communicate that sense of not just as a distant journalist, I want to know what your story is, because that's a professional position to take. You should always take that, but also to say that you're part of the process of trying to help them to recover and to re-engage with life fully.
Thank you, Aidan. Taking advantage that you are here with us already, could you please tell us also, well, we have another question from Emiliano Fernandez, who is asking, how can we stop re-victimizing?
Well, I mean, the way that you stop it is to do what I've just said. It is to make sure that when you're communicating with people, first of all, I agree very much with what's been said about make sure that you're talking with people who are involved in NGOs and support groups who are looking after the victims and survivors. Make sure you get the background so you understand it well. And they will alert you to any problems that really have to be avoided. And so what you don't have to do, and I think that the most important thing to do is, and it goes back to the first question as well, is whatever you do, don't allow the people you're interviewing to re-enter the trauma that they've been through. They've been through that trauma once. That's enough. They don't need to go through it again. So you have to make sure that your approach to them is careful and is sensitive and draws from them the truth of how they see things and how they can contribute. So that's essential. And in a way, journalists need to build some sense of solidarity with survivors in order to help them understand that they have support around them, including the journalists they're cooperating with.
Thank you, Aidan. So now we will move to another question. Maybe we can move to the question that we received for Wahyu. Wahyu Maria Paredes is asking, what are the best ways to not put in risk the lives of our sources who were victims or who still are victims or survivors?
Yeah, thank you. I think Aidan did cover these questions also in his presentation. But I just would like to add that it's really being sensitive to the safe space of to the source, to the victims is one of the main priority to consider. So if sometime when you doing your reporting, you get a chance to visit the location, the exact location where the modern slavery happens, and maybe out of the effort to defend themselves, the actor or the people who did it will try to give you access to interview directly to the victims, and they will be understandably very reluctant to speak with you, and if you force you to interview them and to ask them questions that might be endanger their situation, that will be, very insensitive in that sense. So I think to make sure that you make sure that your sources are safe, you need to consider the setting of the interview. And that's why in my presentation, I said that we often use interviews from survivors who already escaped the situation or the setting of the human trafficking, because that guarantee that they are no longer in in safety in situation that would endanger their safety. So that's one thing.
Thank you, Wahyu. We have here a question for everyone. That is from Bhumika Sarawasti. The person is asking, "Hi, Charles, really appreciate what you said about survivors with an agency. Can you also please talk about human trafficking through sea?"
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bhumika, for your question. I've made reference in my presentation to human trafficking at sea because it's within a very complex issue. It's probably one of the most complex issues to investigate for a journalist because it happens at sea by definition. And this is a topic that we're currently working on with different journalists, including Wahyu, because in the case of Indonesia that he's familiar with, a lot of Indonesian migrant workers will happen to work at sea. Some of them find themselves in forced labor situations, can be trafficked into these situations, and they can be on board fishing vessels for a period as long as 2 years. And that generates, I think, quite evident challenges for journalists. How do you investigate human trafficking where accessing where the human trafficking is happening, where the exploitation is happening, might possibly be impossible physically, I mean, for distant water fishing, which is happening in international waters, maybe very far away from where you are. And when you look at the difficulty to report on this issue, and then you look at how little we actually have stories about human trafficking at sea in the media landscape, you can maybe think why the two are connected. If we have so little stories about this, it is precisely because it's very difficult. Now, afterwards, this is where you go back to what we said with Aidan, which is the start. The start is actually doing your homework. How does commercial fishing work? How are people being recruited? If as a journalist you want to report on these issues, if you do investigate how it works, if you connect with civil society organizations, you'll be able to find ways to overcome some of the technical challenges that exist. I've recently spoken with a journalist from the Philippines who's exposed some cases of human trafficking of Filipino fishers, who told me that one of the ways she would go around to actually identify sources of information was to go through Facebook groups of Filipino fishers, because they organize themselves on social networks and you can access them this way. So it's definitely a very important issue. I think it's very relevant in the framework of the Journalism Fund program, because this is something that connects Asia and Europe. We can find Asian migrant workers fishing off of the coast of Europe or fishing for European consumers. So this is something that definitely is worth investigating.
Thank you for the answer, Charles. Now the same person is asking to everyone, to all the speakers, most times a mafia is operating. Any advices for safety of journalists reporting on the issue? Maybe Wahyu, you can reply this question.
Yeah, I think you are right. I think Charles and Aidan also mentioned that network of perpetrators of human trafficking usually are organized crime, and they have various means to keep their wrongdoings not exposed, and so. Trying to report on this needs quite an understanding of journalistic safety, making sure that you are not become the victim of the perpetrators yourself. So I think my first advice is to always be aware of who you are dealing with. So you have to do your research thoroughly. You have to understand the network and the extent of which they will do to protect their operation. Knowing that background will enables you to also measure what kind of safety precaution that you need to take before you go to the field doing your reporting. So knowing that is very important. So not just go blindly to a place or to expose a network, but knowing this very important information. And once you have that information, you will be able to access any kind of safety measures to make sure that your safety is guaranteed. You don't go to interview the perpetrators alone, or you have to have a backup plan if you are invited to inspect a place where that crime is allegedly happened, that kind of thing. In one occasion, one of my reporters were held hostage by one of the human traffickers because he insists to go there by the invitation of the perpetrators to show that they are not doing anything wrong, and then he ended up being held hostage for a few hours, not letting him go. So if that kind of thing happens, you need to have a backup plan, a security plan to make sure that you can get out from the situation safely.
Thank you, Wahyu. Now, Aidan.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. Of course, safety is absolutely critical. Journalists should always make sure that they make a risk assessment of the potential dangers they face. And we've already seen in the question box quite a lot of dangers. They can be legal action, it can be pressure, threats, and often actually journalists can find themselves being the victims of violence against them because of the stories they're doing. So of course, a risk assessment is really important. I think one of the things that's really helpful is that journalists should use existing networks of investigative journalism to get advice on how to deal with these problems. So there's a Center for Investigative Journalism, there's the International Consortium for Investigative Journalism. These are full of journalists who've got good experience of dealing with the threats that journalists face. And I think that's really quite useful. And what that then leads me to, if I can just sort of say very briefly, and this is taking up some of the questions that are coming up here. Look, this sort of story is a very difficult story for a single journalist to do. It's absolutely essential, it seems to me, that in order to really develop these sorts of stories and to do them effectively, collaboration is needed. Very often that collaboration is between journalists who are working from the same country, but also that collaboration can be with journalists in another country. This is where people are being trafficked to, for example, and so on. So I think that whole question of collaborating with other journalists is extremely important. And it's actually very relevant. For example, tomorrow, the Fetisov Journalism Awards will announce the winners of their prizes for last year. And they've got 13 winners. 8 of those stories, which are all great investigative stories, 8 of them were cross-border collaboration. And it shows that cross-border collaboration can actually deliver the strongest stories. And with more collaboration, you get more opportunities to defend yourself and your own interests.
Thank you, Aidan, for the answer, and thank you, Wahyu, as well. So now we will move to the next question from Natasha Rosner. You have spoken a lot about trafficking from a criminal angle, but what about the structural issues that enable human trafficking, modern slavery, and exploitation? This is often missing from media coverage of modern slavery. Maybe we can go to Charles.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting, very important question. And I'd like to connect it with what Aidan was just saying about the transnational, cross-collaborative dimension. I can share my screen here and show you very quickly a story which I think fits nicely in what you were saying. Those of you who are familiar with the news in the United Kingdom or in Europe have most probably heard of what has been called the Essex lorry tragedy, which happened a couple of years ago, involving Vietnamese migrants who were found dead at the back of a lorry. Because of the nature of this story, which happened in the United Kingdom, the vast majority of people who reported on these issues are journalists from the UK or from around the UK, who obviously for a number of reasons, were limited in their capacity to bring, let's say, the perspective from the country of origin. I'm not sure, but I would argue that the huge majority, if not all, journalists who covered this story from the UK did not actually go to Vietnam to actually understand what happened, or did not necessarily investigate what happened in Vietnam. Now, you have a journalist here who is from Vietnam, Nam Le, who tried to do the story, let's say, the opposite way around. And so what she did is she went to identify families and relatives of those Vietnamese migrants to understand, is this story exactly what journalists are telling us it is, which is just migrants with no agency who have been trafficked, or is it a little bit more complex? It's what's very interesting is that by talking to the families and by trying to understand how each and every one of these individuals, because they were presented as 39 Vietnamese migrants, just as if they were a homogeneous group. Here again, very diverse experiences and stories. And by telling the story, going to the relatives, she provided a lot of interesting context, I think, to understand how complex these issues are. And I don't want to say that the way the story was reported in the UK wasn't good. What I'm trying to say is that if we keep in mind the international, transnational dimension, and if we make an effort to try and identify all of the pieces of the puzzle, we can present the audience with a more complex description of reality. Doesn't make the crime less awful or any different, but I think it's something that's very necessary, especially for those of you who are interested about impact. I've seen several questions around that. You know, just saying yesterday we opened a lorry and we found 39 bodies, it's going to create a lot of emotion, but it's not necessarily going to create much change. Going back into the country of origin, trying to identify how that happened, how people were recruited, who were the intermediaries, how were they maybe pushed by relatives or members of their community into accepting this journey? That is something that can afterwards help us identify policies which can prevent human trafficking situations.
I wonder if I can add, Charles, to that. I don't often intervene to sort of defend the British press, but I have to say that actually, on the coverage of this story, a lot of the media showed not just a great deal of sensitivity in reporting the human interest dimension of the story, but there was actually quite a good and thorough review of the origins of these victims. And it did contribute, I think, to raising awareness, not only of the human ordeal that's involved in this process, but actually what you might call the almost industrial scale nature of the economy of trafficking and how it operates, and how families contribute and make enormous sacrifice in order to try to buy a future for their children. So, I mean, but you're absolutely right. This need to go back and look at the story behind the shocking event is absolutely essential in order to promote some coherent and better understanding of how things develop.
Thank you. We will go now for our last question from Joseph, that it says, in West Africa, victims in trafficking in persons varies because in some settings, the suspected traffickers in most cases claim that they are in connection with some security personnel in the communities by influencing these officers with money. What do you think can be done to report traffickers in contacts with higher ups in the security system in your country? Maybe Wahyu, we can reply to this question.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most common pattern in the human traffickers network, because it's a risky criminal activity. Usually, they try to get protection from within, the law enforcement. Of course, corrupt officials within the law enforcement usually protect this kind of activities. I think that's a story in itself. I think it's an angle that's very, very important to expose in writing this story. So not only focusing on the plight of the survivors or how the crime happened, but also the enablers, people who not directly involved, but make this appalling condition continue to happen, such as this corrupt law enforcement officials. I think that's one of the most common pattern happening in Indonesia as well.
Thank you, Wahyu. Aidan, maybe you can also add something else to this as well.
Yeah, I agree with what Wahyu said. But it seems to me that there is a need to focus attention on what you might call not just official corruption and the way that corruption operates within the country, but I think there are organizations that are complicit in trafficking who are not properly held to account. Earlier on in this conversation, there was a question related to agencies in East Africa that are hiring people as domestic servants and sending them to the Middle East, to the Gulf states in the Middle East, and very often into conditions which are quite horrifying and so on. So the question is, how do these employment agencies who are sending people abroad, how do they get people together? How do they protect them? And what measures are in place to protect the people who are sent abroad? And there are many examples effectively of domestic labor being recruited and sent abroad. Now, it's human trafficking of the worst kind, but it's not properly held to account. So it's not always illegal. Very often it's just unregulated and uncontrolled. So there's a lot of good journalism that needs to be done about, as I was saying earlier, the institutions that are in plain sight are there for all of us to see. And we just need to ask more questions about how they work and how they ensure and protect the interests of the people they're sending abroad.
Thank you, Aidan. Maybe something to say as well, Charles?
No, I think it's been said, but it's part of the complexity I was referring to in my presentation. When we talk of organized crime, some of us might think it's completely outside of the public space, but no, the interconnections are often very important. Forced labor as a crime, which involves about 25 million persons currently. The illegal profits generated by forced labor are estimated to be around $150 billion US. Now, these 150 billion US dollars end up in a number of pockets, some of which can be completely outside the public space, some of which not. And so this is why, I think we need to stress, how complex this issue is. And that's also why I think what you're trying to do with the project and, in helping journalists connect on these issues, also connect with civil society organizations is so important. It's not just for the context, for the expertise. It's also that when you're looking at a complex issue, looking at as a group is often easier than trying to do it by yourself. Aidan was right to mention that in the case of the Fetisov Awards, but I think if you look recently at some of the most important international awards, some of which are thematic or not, many stories who have won recently are stories that are related to human trafficking issues, or at least very important human trafficking investigations have often ended up by winning important awards because they are truly very important for our societies.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Aidan. Thank you, Wahyu, for all your interventions. I'm sure that journalists and the people who were today attending to this webinar, they learned a lot from your experiences and from your work. So now I would like to inform you that we will be issuing a certificate. So if you would like to receive one, we just sent the link in the chat for those who are here in the webinar, but also we would like to share with you the code QR in case those who couldn't attend to this webinar but were registered on time, you could also access to this. So let me share my screen with all of you so you can also have this code. Let me, okay, so I have it here, and then you will see it on your screens. So there it is. You can scan this QR code, and if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to contact us. Our email address is there, modernslavery@journalismfund.eu. In case you have more questions about our grant program, also about this training or about coming webinars, you can also subscribe to our newsletter. So here is the code in case you want to receive a certificate, but also in case you have other questions, you can write and reach us. Don't forget that we have a new call for our Modern Slavery Grant Program on the 17th March. So everyone who is interested, you can apply in this call. And also don't forget that we can also give you some pre-application advice in case you need our assistance. And also our speakers, we will they will share with us their presentations. So we will try also to share it with all of you. And apologies for those who couldn't access. Apparently we had some issues with the link that has been updated just before our webinar. So we will also try to reach you, but anyways, if you have the possibility to see and to watch the webinar on Facebook, and you can also see the code QR to access to our survey, and then we can send you the certificate. So once again, thank you so much to our attendees and to our panelists as well. Thank you for all your interventions. Thank you for all the information you share with us, and I'm sure we can really be working on this issue and helping to those people who have been affected by human trafficking and other kind of issues like this one. So thank you. Thank you. We will close this session. Thank you. And
Bye.
well, we expect to see you in the coming webinars to all those who were participating today. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you so much.